Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Yeah. So, as Liz, mentioned, I'm a substitute. So, I don't know if it's part of the recycling process. Where we're trying to make use of some of the leftovers, but yeah, please bear with me. I'm not the expert in this field, but we're trying to do a project, and I think if you're successful with this, it can be a pilot or a roadmap or a starting point for the revival of the textile industry. So thanks, Shirley. So yeah, it's just to look at a particular project that we've been involved in, and as we go through the project and unpacking the system, is to try and identify opportunities to actually make use of for circular economy applications. So what we want to speak about today, I have to stand here now. I'm not used to standing still, so please. Yeah, so what we want to speak about today, just the project itself, what it actually stands for, where it's come from, what are the key concepts that we're trying to promote, in the project itself. There are two tools that we intend to use, for the project to try and actually realize the outputs that we desire. And then, lastly, just speak a bit about, potential opportunities for implementing circular economy ideas. Yeah, so InTEX, it stands for, and I had to write this down because I can never remember it, Innovative Business Practices and Economic Models in the Textile Value Chain. So I'll give you a moment to absorb that, which is why we just call it InTEX. But as the name suggests, we're looking at innovation. We're not only looking at, in the old days we would look at perhaps just the cleaner production side of things, how resources are being used, but we actually want to look at the actual business practices itself now. We also want to look at extending that not only into the manufacturing environment, but to actually extend it upwards to the suppliers and downwards to the consumers. Because if we do, for example, a cleaner production assessment, and we can optimize the process, if there are no sales, the business will still fail. If you don't have access to raw materials at a particular point in time when you require them, the business will still fail. So the idea is not only to look at the manufacturing side, but upstream and downstream to try and ensure that the value chain remains sustainable. Okay, and that's where the InTEX actually comes from, and you'll see the X is for the value chain itself. The program was initiated in 2020 due to COVID and various sort of other delays. We only sort of got off the ground towards the end, the third quarter of last year. And yeah, it's been an eye-opening experience, if anything. Because like I said, generally we were focusing on, on the manufacturing environment only. As the previous speaker mentioned, there's a big trend towards what we call life cycle analysis. Not only looking at the product during manufacture, but also what happens to it after it's being used, what happens, in terms of the waste as well. In terms of our project, we will look at, the suppliers, and perhaps in a future project, we'll look at, the actual growing of either raw materials or the manufacture of some of the synthetic materials as well. So the project is funded by the European Union, and, I'll speak a bit later about, why they've actually funding the project. And it consists of a number of components. So two of the components are global, where they're looking at not only suppliers, but looking at how they're actually going to be monitoring, how they're going to be implementing and evaluating various suppliers from around the world. And then three components which are national components. And these are where they've looked at specific countries in Africa, South Africa being one of them, and saying, how can we assist or how can we ensure that the textile industry in South Africa remains sustainable. But again, in the context, not only manufacturing, the entire value chain. So think about it in terms of the value chain. Here's a reference for, for those of you who've got internet access and, lots of time on your hands. Please, there's a lot more information. They've got some tools that are available, a lot of resources. And so this part of, the presentation is also about awareness. The more people that, become aware of it, the more successful the program will actually be. Oops. So as I've mentioned, we've got an African implementation. 3 countries are involved. One is Tunisia, one is Kenya, and the other one being South Africa. And the countries that were chosen each have some unique sort of flavor. And I just want to highlight, there are many similarities, with pressure being placed on what are termed developing countries, their production and their outputs, imports and exports. But just to give you an indication of some of the unique differences. So, for example, in Tunisia, the textile industry accounts for 20%, of the GDP. And that's a lot. Most of their product, is sold in the European market. So there's a lot of competition for them to, from a global competitive perspective. If we look at Kenya, their textile sector represents about 10% of their GDP. What is special about Kenya is, they've got a unique situation where other first world countries are dumping their clothing, onto that market, and it's putting pressure on the local industry. So slightly different, type of characteristics, but interesting for us because as we share our information, we can all learn from those experiences and try and prevent that from happening. So again, it's really about how can we share our information and make sure that, all our countries are successful. From a South African perspective, the textile industry only represents about 2.5%, so it sounds like it's small, but it's very important in terms of unemployment. And this is where, we believe that the South African textile industry can actually be a lever to try and alleviate unemployment. It's a very, very quick to actually deploy and to create that employment given the correct environment. And again, what we're looking for is not a short-term temporary type of work, but we're trying to make sure that it's sustainable. So this is the context, in which the projects, have been formed for the various countries. Each of us are working sort of in parallel, and we have regular feedback meetings between ourselves and including our, our partners. And in this way, we can actually try and share the knowledge and, gain from that. In terms of South Africa, we've got a number of international partners, some local partners as well. So unfortunately, it's not a one-man or one-person job. So from a funding perspective, as I've mentioned, the European Union is, is funding the program. From an international perspective, we have UNEP, which is United Nations Environmental Program, and they're actually looking at coordinating, each of the countries' outputs. From a South African perspective, we've got the National Culinary Production Center, and them together with the DTIC, they're looking at it from a South African context perspective. And then lastly, we've got what we call the South African Technical Intermediary, and they have to do the work. So, somebody's got to actually, do the legwork, and that's where we, we found ourselves. Having said that, being on the ground, we've been to a number of companies, so far, and being on the ground, you get to see the information. You get to see firsthand, some of the complexities, some of the things that you don't read about in in the journals or in the articles or in the scientific analyses, but these are the realities that are facing, South Africa. So, for example, we've had the floods in, in KwaZulu-Natal, and it was very interesting for me because, they had the floods, so it's got so much water, and the following day, there was no water because the floods had washed away a lot of the piping systems. So some of the companies that we actually went to were standing outside, collecting buckets of water from the municipality. It's a very unique situation, that we faced, and this was just sort of knock on from our very famous, load shedding that we have. And, so yeah, it's just sort of adding on and adding on, and just putting extra pressure, on our on our manufacturing industry. Added to that, of course, is going to be the effects of COVID, which we're still, trying to unpack, and we're still trying to actually analyze and actually quantify. But in a nutshell, it's made people realize that they can actually get by with less. So that consumer power, has actually diminished. But, yeah. In terms of the textiles, though, the industry is actually still growing. So as I've mentioned, it represents about 2.5% of the South Africa's manufacturing output, CTFL. So, unfortunately, in any business, you've got to learn all these jargons. Clothing, textile, footwear, and leather. So everything that you're wearing, it actually encompasses that, but it goes a step further. The seat that you're sitting on, the fabric, it includes those things as well. At home, when you get home, you're going to sleep on a nice duvet, so the sheets, the pillows, even the stuffing for the pillows form part of the textile industry. Okay? So just think about it in terms of that. 4,500 manufacturers, so I apologize, we don't have the reference in here, but this comes from DTIC. And yeah, if we look at what the industry was in, let's say, 1994, 1995, there was a sharp decline, for the first 10 years up until about 2006. And the estimates are that about the actual manufacturing market shrunk by about 37%. Okay, for various reasons, and we won't go into that now. And then after that, with fluctuations or changes in the rand, the market has more or less stabilized, but the industry, is still under pressure. And added to, our unique situation in South Africa, the load shedding, the COVID, the high unemployment, the industry is actually still under pressure. Having said that, the industry is still growing. So if our local market is shrinking, it means the imports are actually growing. And unfortunately, this is true for probably a lot of the other countries and for even some other industries in South Africa as well. So our imports have been growing, and most of them coming from China. So this is something that, we've, in our engagements with the companies, we've picked up, so far. So really something that we need to develop and find, a solution for if we want to remain sustainable and actually grow the industry in South Africa. Okay, so what does the InTEX project actually involve? So as I've mentioned, there are two tools that we intend to use. Sorry, there are two tools that we intend to use. One is what we call, eco-innovation. The second one is what we call product environmental footprint. And the last one is not so much a tool, but it's more an overall theme that we're trying to incorporate into everything, and we call that circularity. The previous speaker, has spoken about, circularity, so I don't want to delve into that, too much. But in essence, instead of purchasing an item of clothing, wearing it, and then throwing it away or disposing of it in a waste or a landfill, to say, can I reuse that? Can somebody else reuse that? And perhaps take part of that fabric and make it into some other implement. Or to take that fabric and then reconstitute it into another, item. And in this way, we create that circularity where we reuse, the fabrics, the yarns, whatever we've actually made, and try and use it as much as possible. So, I usually tell people that I only buy second-hand vehicles, and they say, but why? they're inefficient. I said, no, but it's my principle of recycling. You know, I'm reusing the vehicle. So in order to make another vehicle, somebody's got to go and do some mining and get that metal. There's a lot of water, there's a lot of energy that's actually being used. And again, we tend not to always think about that. We focus on the vehicle, and the manufacturer will tell us, this thing is so light on fuel, and this thing uses so much, and it's so green. But in order to actually produce that, you know, there's a lot of energy, a lot of resources that have actually gone into that. And the same way, if we think about our material or the fabric, that a lot of effort has gone into actually producing the fabric in the first place. And there's also something that we want to try, you know, and minimize, try and quantify as we understand or unpack, you know, the entire value chain. So at this stage, we're not there yet. We're starting at manufacturing, and we're going to work our way outwards. But the idea is to have the entire value chain mapped so that we can know exactly, you know, what our actual resource output or contribution to the environment is. The key thing, and we've mentioned that, you know, we're using what we call a value chain approach. And here we've identified, or we're looking at identifying some what we call environmental hotspots. So some of these we've already, you know, looked at and unpacked, you know, as part of our ongoing project. For example, cotton cultivation. We look, you know, what fertilizers are being used, what herbicides are being used, and what damage is that actually causing to the soil? What damage is that causing to our water systems downstream? And how can we actually improve that? Can we actually change? Are there typically what we call greener chemicals that we can use? Are there better agricultural methodologies that we can use where we use water perhaps more effectively? Another hotspot identified was what we call wet finishing. So very intense, energy-intensive process where, you know, perhaps dyeing some sort of fabric or changing. So you need quite a bit of heat after you've processed the fabric to dry out, to get the moisture out of it. So again, something to try and unpack, you know, as part of our project. Washing and drying, and here we're not so much looking at it from a manufacturing perspective. But let's think about an item of clothing. If you've got a shirt or a blouse, how many times will you put that into the washing machine or hand wash it before you're actually going to dispose of it? 10 times? 100 times? If it's really good quality, maybe 500 times. But at each point, you're consuming a certain amount of water. You're consuming a certain amount of energy, and you're consuming a certain amount of chemicals, you know, for the washing powder itself. So again, these are things that we're trying to identify, and as part of this program, hopefully we can get some sort of quantification, you know, for that. By creating that awareness, immediately people start thinking about it, and we hope it will influence, you know, the behavior. And again, understanding that over the entire value chain, then we can try and make some sort of improvement. The development of synthetic fibers also consume either fossil fuel as an energy input, or perhaps, you know, some of the polymers also, you know, manufactured, and they consume certain chemicals as well. But just to give you an idea of some of the hotspots that we've identified. Again, if you think about the value chain, we cannot do everything in one shot. So it's about choosing where we can actually leverage, where we can actually make the most impact, you know, at this point in time, and then effectively using something with something similar to the 80-20 principle. Okay. Linear models versus circular models. I think the previous speakers already spoken about that, but it's essentially trying to look at, I'm getting my input raw material, I do some fiber production, I process that into some sort of fabric, I start wearing that, I use that, and eventually, what do I do when I'm done? Can I reuse that into another product? Can I palm that off, or perhaps use that in a different industry where they can make use of that as an input raw material? Or am I just going to throw it away? And that's the question we need to start asking ourselves. So clothing is something which is very close to us, if you pardon the pun. But yes, once we start thinking about that, now we can start thinking also, what about energy? What about water? What about all the other resources that we consume on a daily basis and we tend to take for granted? We put pressure on the manufacturer and the suppliers to say, you must make it more efficient, you must do this. But there's a role that we can also play. And then hopefully as part of this process, we can try and unpack and quantify that as well. Eco-innovation is not something that's new. It's been around for a number of years. What is new is the latest methodology. So they've improved on the methodology and tried to make it as standardized as possible. So the way we're going to implement in South Africa will be exactly the same way they're going to be implementing in Kenya, the same way they'll be implementing in Tunisia, and hopefully in other countries as well. If you look at I'm not sure about the colors, but it's got a little circular format, and for those of you, familiar with perhaps lean manufacturing, in concept similar to Plan, Do, Check, Act. In this case, we're taking it one step higher to a management level, and we're looking, let's look at the business as it is now. Try and understand what the business is. What are the visions? What are the goals? What strategy has the business actually set, in order to actually be sustainable or in order to grow? How do we make that into a business model that you can actually monitor and track? So in other words, we want to create, some sort of roadmap, but before we do that, we want to say, this is our current state. Now in terms of my vision, this is where I would like to be. Let me build a roadmap to try and achieve that. And again, it doesn't mean that, we're starting this year and, by the time Christmas comes around, everything will be solved. It is a long process. And you can see some of the structural challenges that we're facing. It's not going to be something that will be solved, overnight. So again, we're going to try and take a phased approach and make sure that we do each step at a time and that each step becomes sustainable, but keeping focus on what the long-term goals actually are. Lastly, we're going to look at implementing, and again, as part of the project, we won't go to every single company, but we will choose selected projects and assist the company with the implementation as well, and that's where hopefully we'll get some input from NCPC and DTIC to give us some guidance in terms of the companies, in terms of the funding that we can actually unlock for that, and then to review. Very important to review, have we been successful? Have we achieved what we had set out to achieve? If we did not, why not? And this way improve either the methodology or try and understand perhaps some of the assumptions that we had made that were perhaps incorrect. So very important to try and close that loop and then start over again. And this is really, the principle that we're going to be, the approach that we'll be taking, for eco-innovation. Again, just providing the reference. Lee, everybody will be getting a copy of the presentation. Please, take a look at that. This manual is 380 pages. So a very good bedtime reading. For those of you that have insomnia, I'm sure it will solve the problem. But yeah, again, we're not going to, you can take extracts from there. We've tried to make it as comprehensive as possible to cover all aspects of business. But each business is going to be uniquely different. And we'll speak a bit about, some of the businesses. Oh, okay. Yeah, so, oops. So UNEP, again, the eco-innovation, the manual that we showed you comes from UNEP itself. And it's based on the life cycle principle. So as Lee said, it follows on from what the speaker was speaking about, before me. But in this approach, we want to look at the business models. We want to look at the business strategies. We want to look at the goals. So it's not so much going into the company and say, if you change this spoiler over here, if you manufacture this type of product, you can actually improve. We're looking at it now from a management strategy perspective. And this is important because that is the area where we want to have the linkages between the supplier and the consumer. And as part of our project, it's important to actually create that linkages because, as I mentioned right up front, I can have the most efficient manufacturing plant, but if I don't have raw materials, I can't produce anything. And if I don't have a customer, I can produce, but I can't sell anything. So those linkages, are very, very important, and we want those linkages to occur at management level. So that's really the principle of eco-innovation, and that's the level that we're going to be pitching it at. It has been working in a number of countries, already before, but again, they were looking at it more from a process or a particular process perspective. This new methodology is trying to unpack or understand the entire value chain. Okay, the second tool that that I mentioned that's going to be part of the program is the PEF. Oh, it's another abbreviation. Okay. So, who's heard of a carbon footprint? I'm sure everybody's heard of a carbon footprint. So this one's called the product environmental footprint. Okay. What we're trying to do here is similar to when you're consuming energy or in your manufacturing process, there are certain fossil fuels that you actually use. What we're looking at is, if I produce a product, what is the impact on the environment? Okay. So if you look at what we've got here on the left-hand side, quite a number of labels from various countries, from various standards authorities. Which one is better? Which one is more correct? Which one is more appropriate? We don't really know. And we can always have the argument that but the German one is better than the French one, and the French will say no, but they're better than the English. Where does South Africa actually fit in? And this is what UNEP is trying to do as part of this part of the project, is to create a single evaluation model to compare products like for like. So for example, if we were to manufacture a jeans in South Africa, we can use this product environmental footprint model and compare it to a similar jeans being made in Brazil, for example, and then compare what is the environmental impact. So this is the idea behind it. If you think about it, you can see there's a lot of data, a lot of numbers that actually need to go in. And speaking with our partners, they've spent years now, a couple of years already, trying to develop all the numbers that go into the background, including all the chemicals, including all the usages. So really intensive from an IT perspective. What we're going to do is going to put in the numbers, and because it's using a standardized model, we can actually evaluate from there. So the idea is to have some sort of harmonized methodology in which we can actually compare and benchmark. Okay, so that was not me. Oh, it was me. Yeah, so it's based on the LCA also. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that our methodology of evaluation is reproducible, it's consistent, it's comparable, and it's also practical. So it's probably going to be running in some sort of online format, And so South Africa, Kenya, and Tunisia are part of the first rollout, of this product environmental footprint, and we, quite eager to see, what the results are going to be. Okay, so just in terms of the evaluation, they've listed 16 different impact categories. So, for example, climate change, water scarcity, land usage, resource usage from a mineral perspective, aquatic freshwater eutrophication, and quite a number of others. And each item or each garment that is being manufactured will be evaluated according to these 16 impact categories. Okay. So, what is key about it? It was started in 2013. And as I said, we're still in development, depending on the type of products or garments that we're going to come up with. They're going to be developing the databases to support that, as we go along. Very nice, it's independently verified. So, the supplier, the manufacturer, will always put a stamp of approval and say, my product is the best. Now we're going to have some sort of independent verification methodology. Okay? We're also going to be looking at developing what we call PFCRs. It's another, acronym. So that is now standing for I don't know what that stands for the contact rules. So for specific products, they're going to have a category, and a rule associated with that category. So jeans will have a specific category because that's manufactured differently to perhaps a jacket. So for each of those, they're hoping to have specific rules and guidelines so that the evaluation can be standardized. Okay, so which companies have we involved in South Africa? So yes, we've chosen in conjunction with NCPC and also our international partners, we've chosen 10 companies, 5 companies in KZN, which includes home textiles and apparel, 3 companies in the Western Cape, and then 2 in Gauteng. What we've also tried to do is look at it from a small CMT perspective. Our smallest company has 6 employees, to some of the larger companies which have maybe 150, 200 employees. So trying to get that sort of balance. We've got one company in footwear, we've got another company, in particular clothing, synthetics, other one in natural fibers. So trying to get an overall base for each of them. KZN, because that's where most of the manufacturing actually occurs. Okay, in terms of circularity, and now we're getting to the crux of the matter. When we think about circularity, we're taking the approach that we need to understand our business strategy and our business models first. So instead of looking at it from a per process or a per part sub-process perspective, let me look at the overall concept. Let me rethink how I'm going to be designing, how I'm going to be manufacturing, how I'm going to be using, my garments or my textiles in future. So the main idea is to reduce by design. This means that before I even start, can I adapt my design in terms of where I'm going to source my raw materials, which raw materials I'm going to use, how I'm actually going to manufacture it, how I expect the consumer to actually use that and dispose of that before I actually make anything. So just by designing that out, we don't go through the process of unnecessary waste. And this is part of what we're thinking about in terms of circularity. So it's not only can I reuse it, but to actually use as little of the resource in the first place. As I've mentioned, it requires a host of new business models, and this is what we're hoping to unpack with the eco-innovation tool. And then second to that, we're going to try and identify one or two of the garments that are being manufactured and take that through a product environmental footprint study, and see how successful, or see how quantify actually what the impact is on the, on the environment. So yeah, we're going to look at trying to promote circular supply chains, looking at those products where we can actually have extended use, products that we can actually reuse. Some of the ideas that that have been mooted in our discussion, for example, I think one of our colleagues from Kenya was saying, let's make a jeans, and when you're done with the jeans, we can take that material and make a little baby jeans, and you pass it on to your child. So not only, are you sort of creating that in like a sort of a family legacy, but you're also creating that awareness in your child, that we can actually reuse. We don't always have to actually buy new. So this is some of the thinking, some of the ideas that actually, have been mooted. Still relatively, new in concept, but we're hoping that at the end of this project, we've identified at least some of them which can actually be implemented. Okay, in terms of COVID-19, I've mentioned already, people have realized that they can actually get by with less. People have realized that they can actually purchase online. They don't need to go to a store anymore. So one element in terms of transport has been, eliminated. The fact that you actually need to have a retail store has also been eliminated. So we have now shorter supply chains. We can also create a lot more, because everything's online and they've got all these fancy, data analytics. Instead of having one large distribution center, you can actually now have localized distribution centers, and again, reduce the output, in terms of transport. So these are just some of the ideas, that are being mooted, in terms of circularity itself. Okay, and then lastly, as I've mentioned, some of the companies that we've taken on board include SMEs. The larger companies, they usually have in-house resources to do this sort of thing, to set aside some time and develop, R&D. But the SMEs don't actually have that. So the idea is we're going to be doing some knowledge building with them. We're going to be assisting them with some data analysis, and then hopefully after that also some technical assistance, in terms of the equipment that they actually use. So, and that in a nutshell is the project. Thank you.